In the summer of 1245, a Franciscan friar was riding east. Europe was 2,000 miles behind him, his eventual destination many more miles ahead. He carried letters from the Pope. The Holy Father was hoping to dissuade the great Khan, leader of all the Mongols, from any further raids into Europe. And he was even prepared to offer him the gift of baptism into Holy Mother Church. In the Europe which Friar Carpini had left behind, prayers were said almost constantly. The plea was always the same: deliverance from the Mongols. Only 4 years before, the Devil's Horsemen had annihilated both the European armies set against them. But it was more than a military disaster. It was a shattering psychological defeat for which Europe was profoundly unprepared. The church was the center of all learning, yet to even the best-informed cleric, the lands to the east were a total mystery. They were peopled by strange, fantastical creatures. Christian Europe was seen as an island of civilization and reason set in a sea of monsters and myths. When Europe encountered the Mongol hordes, the experience merely confirmed the horrors of the unknown. Images of creatures from the East filled medieval manuscripts and were uncritically accepted throughout Europe. There were headless beings with faces in their chests, and horned pygmies, Amazons, gold-digging ants, and even men with their feet pointing backwards. These legends were endorsed by the church, the most important source of knowledge for medieval man. So while the Mongols were building their empire in Asia, all Europe saw was a cloud of myths. The only other part of the world Europeans knew anything about was the place they regarded as the center of the universe. For more than a century, Europe had been obsessed with the Holy Land, the land where Christianity was born. The focus of Christian pilgrimage was Jerusalem. This was the Holy of Holies to both Christians and Muslims, though it had been under Islamic rule for about 500 years. So it became the focal point for 2 centuries of holy war, the Crusades. 150 years before the Mongol invasion of Europe, Pope Urban preached the First Crusade. Soldiers of Christ were promised a place in heaven. They set out to destroy the infidel and to regain this holy city for Christ. Ranged against them was the sophisticated world of Islam. It was a society no less driven by religious zeal. The Crusaders eventually stormed Jerusalem in 1099. Then, in God's name and in a self-righteous rage, they hunted down and slaughtered almost every non-Christian they could find. They behaved like any other invading army. Across the Holy Land, the Crusaders set up kingdoms and principalities. To defend them, they built formidable fortresses, like this one in northern Syria, Crac des Chevaliers, Castle of the Knights. It has been called the most perfect castle ever built. Muslims called it a bone in the throat of Islam. Crusaders called it the key to our lands. But the Christian God's protection of the Crusaders did not last. Under the great Muslim leader, Saladin, Islam won back its lands. And although Crac des Chevaliers held firm, Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187. Islamic supremacy had been reimposed 88 years after Christians had taken the holy city. News of the loss of Jerusalem horrified Europe. It was said that the true cross had been lost in the battle. The ailing Pope allegedly died of shock. Europe was in mourning. In its anguish and its despair, Christendom turned to religious rumor and legend. A myth had arisen around a mysterious and marvelous figure who held sway somewhere in the unknown lands of the farthest east. If somehow he could be contacted and his help enlisted, he might be the salvation of Europe and her beleaguered armies in the Holy Land. Prester John, a priest king, ruler of all the East. This was Christianity at its most wishful. The stories about him probably came from ancient legends of the Magi, wise men of the East. As reports appeared in letters and chronicles describing this Christian king in the Orient, hope grew. Jerusalem and the Holy Land could be retaken. Pictures were passed from church to church, each more imaginative than the last. Medieval maps often included an enthroned Prester John. Then the myth was enhanced by rumors of distant events. The great Islamic cities of Samarkand and Bukhara had been reduced to rubble. Muslims were under attack by a mysterious foe who sprang from nowhere and disappeared again after destroying Islamic armies. Muslims were dying, and if someone was killing the infidel, it had to be Prester John. The myth was now unquestioned, and Europe celebrated. Salvation was not far off. God had answered their prayers. But it was no priest king who had conquered the Muslims. It was Genghis Khan and his hordes. Europe, desperately clinging to its fantasies, was completely unprepared for the shock when, 20 years later, the Mongol armies invaded and sacked Poland and Hungary. God himself seemed to have abandoned Christendom. The tragedy was beyond comprehension. The end of the world was come. For Christian Europe, if the Mongols were not the savior Prester John, then they were the Antichrist, the harbingers of Armageddon itself. The church claimed these devil horsemen were divine punishment for the sins of man, none other than the foul people of Gog and Magog, servants of Satan, who would be let loose at the end of time. The medieval chronicler and monk Matthew Paris claimed that the Mongols ate their prisoners, and this was accepted as fact, even though most Europeans had never actually set eyes on a Mongol.
We shall send these Tartars back to hell where they came from, or they will send us to heaven, which awaits the chosen.
But Armageddon was postponed. The Mongols left Europe after the death of their great Khan, Ogadai. Europe feared that they would return, so here at Lyon Cathedral, the new Pope, Innocent IV, convoked a council to seek a solution to the Mongol threat. The Pope wanted to find out the real intentions of the Mongols and, if possible, to convert them to Christianity. So, from this throne, he sent an envoy across the world to find and talk to the Mongol leaders. He chose a monk from the newly formed Franciscan order.